We will restore science to its rightful place and wield technology's wonders.
We live in an age of science, technology, progress. Modern science has remade our world. But at what cost? During the first half of the 20th century, three prophetic writers warned about the dark side of scientific and technological progress: G.K. Chesterton, George Orwell, and C.S. Lewis. Best known for his Narnia stories and his books of Christian theology, C.S. Lewis also had an intense interest in the growing power of scientism, the effort to use the methods of science to explain and control every part of human life.
Lewis was very much a skeptic and a critic of scientism.
He was opposed to an ideology which, in his view, had been confused with science. It was a particular materialistic approach which wanted to reduce everything that we could learn scientifically to materialistic causes, blind, undirected causes.
Lewis thought that science was a perfectly legitimate enterprise. He never denied it. He in fact studied it quite a bit.
He never, so far as I know, attacked science itself. What he attacked was scientism, this idea that the method, or the methods really, of natural science should be the bar by which every other intellectual discipline must be held.
Just like in all human disciplines, Lewis thought that science could be corrupted, and that some people could pursue science because they wanted power over the world and power over other people in particular.
And I think what he saw was that you had to avoid those extremes in the not only in the employment of science, but in the popularization of it. You could not afford to ignore the finding of science, the importance of scientific method. You had to see that it's one of the greatest applications and developments of the rational method per se, a subset of the rational method, but that it was very dangerous, and that in the 20th century it had had very malignant consequences to deify it. Scientific socialism is credibly a scientific version of politics. The Marxists called their system scientific socialism. Well, no one in his right mind in 2012 will say that Marxism was scientific. No one in his right mind, but people did for 150 years, 170 years. Social Darwinist racial science in Nazi Germany. Enormous prestige was given to racialist views by their apparent clothing. People such as Haeckel and Molschat and Büchner popularizing reductive scientific ideas with immense success. In many ways, more success in Germany than in England. Lewis saw these developments. He saw that two world wars, in which one he served and was badly wounded, had roots in barbaric and hysterical scientistic ideas, abuses of the scientific method, abuses of scientific terminology and language, abuses of scientific faith.
When warning about the abuse of science, Lewis made an unusual comparison. Although most people think of science as something modern, Lewis compared it to something ancient, magic.
C.S. Lewis thought that science and magic are twins. Now, if you think about this, this might seem very strange, but I think that Lewis was very perceptive here. In fact, he highlighted 3 different ways that science and magic really are quite similar.
The first way science and magic are similar, according to Lewis, is their ability to function as a religion.
Certainly, a magical view of the world can give one a sense that there's something more than just our everyday lives. If you walk through a forest and think it's enchanted, it gives you a sense of a grand vision that there's something out there that we don't ordinarily experience. It can give you a sense of meaning. I think there's a real reason why fantasy stories are so beloved, whether it be Lewis's own Chronicles of Narnia or J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. It really strikes a deep chord in people, whether they're religious or not, about a sense of grandeur in the universe, something higher than ourselves. And in fact, for some people who aren't religious, this magical view of the world can actually be even more attractive because it substitutes for that. Well, in the same way, science can be an alternate religion. And during Lewis's own time, there were people like H.G. Wells who turned, say, Darwin's theory of evolution into this cosmic theory of life developing in this blind struggle in the universe, and then human life develops sort of this heroic character fighting against nature, and then eventually man evolved and evolves himself through eugenics into a race of demigods.
But for man, no rest and no ending. He must go on, conquest beyond conquest. First this little planet and its winds and waves, and then all the laws of mind and matter that restrain him. Then the planets about him, and at last out across immensity to the stars. And when he has conquered all the deeps of space and all the mysteries of time, still he will be beginning.
And this sort of epic struggle, this cosmic struggle of evolution was really an alternate religion for H.G. Wells. And you see that same thing today. Whether it be Oxford biologist Richard Dawkins, who says that Darwin helps us become an intellectually fulfilled atheist, or in 2012 we had 10 to 20,000 people converge on Washington, D.C. in the United States. For this Reason rally, where a lot of the people testifying, where they really offer science as a religion.
If you look at the Royal Society of London, the equivalent for the British Commonwealth, again, about 90% of them are atheists.
And so today I think you see a lot of people speaking in the name of science who offer science as a quasi-religion. It's what gives their lives meaning. Another area that we see this today is in the whole celebration of Darwin's birthday. Hundreds of colleges, community organizations, if not thousands around the world, on February 12th every year hold Darwin Day celebrations. Sometimes they have birthday cakes, they have special concerts even, with hymns towards Darwin. I mean, it really takes on the trappings of a religion.
With the knowledge of the first atomic explosions to guide us, our chances for survival will be far better than those of the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, if we act on our knowledge and are prepared.
A second way science and magic are similar, according to Lewis, is their encouragement of a lack of skepticism.
Now again, this may seem just completely outlandish, because science, how does that promote gullibility? Science is supposed to be just the hard facts. Now, of course, magic, you can think of in the tribes has a witch doctor and they believe whatever the witch doctor says. And so being magical thinking can promote a type of credulous thinking where you just trust what the authority figure says. But how does science promote that type of credulous or gullible thinking? Lewis pointed out that in the modern world, people will believe almost anything if it's dressed up in the name of science.
He's going to be all right.
Of course he's going to be all right. Sure, Mom. The doc here just wants to cut a little of the badness out of me.
For Lewis, one of the leading examples of science-fueled gullibility was Fraudianism. Lewis had an interest in Sigmund Freud since his days as an Oxford undergraduate. Lewis was intrigued by some of the claims of psychoanalysis, but he ultimately rejected the effort by Freud's followers to explain everything from religion to stealing cars as a result of our subconscious urges.
Before the police finally caught up with him, Peter took about 30 cars. A car had meaning to him. In a symbolic way, it represented his mother. Since he could not get her, he had to have a substitute, and a car was that substitute. Hence his thrill every time he drove a car. Hence his continuous stealing. To the average reader, such an explanation may seem far-fetched, yet clinical experience shows that a car often stands for a woman. In daily language, we often call a car she. When we have the tank filled with gasoline, we say, fill her up.
Well, Lewis pointed out that if you actually take Freud's view to its eventual conclusion, that actually undermines even a belief in Freudianism.
Suppose you had a Freud, somebody kind of like Freud, and this person who is kind of like Freud said, no one ever believes anything for a reason because there's always some other explanation for why they believe it, other than their reason for believing it. Well, that would be true of religious people, but it would also be true of Freud, right? Freud himself.
Lewis's point is, where does this end? If you really think that all reasoning fundamentally is based on sub-rational urges and that we can't analyze those urges and there isn't real reason that we can judge based on evidence, and that we can't be self-critical, then that destroys Freudianism just like it destroys everything else.
Shortly after Lewis accepted Christianity, he satirized Freud in his allegory, The Pilgrim's Regress. In Lewis's story, the main character John ends up being thrown in jail by a character named Sigismund Enlightenment.
Sigismund was actually Sigmund Freud's real first name. He ended up shortening it later. And so this was very much a parody of Freud. But what is this jail that he's thrown into? Well, it's a jail governed by this giant. And this giant has a particular propensity that anything that he looks at becomes transparent. And so when this pilgrim character is thrown into this dungeon, into this jail, it's a jail of horrors, because whenever he looks at someone, he doesn't see them, he sees their insides, their intestines, he sees through them. And it's horrible. It's like a house of horrors. And that was Lewis's pictures, really, of where Freudianism leads you. If you try to deconstruct everything, you're left with nothing.
Another example of science-inspired gullibility, according to Lewis, was what he called evolutionism, the popular idea that matter could magically transform itself into complex and conscious living things through a blind and unguided process. Lewis's doubts about unguided evolution went back to his days as a soldier in World War I. While recovering from shrapnel wounds, a young Lewis read the book Creative Evolution by French natural philosopher Henri Bergson. Bergson questioned the ability of Darwin's theory to account for complex structures like the human eye through a blind process like natural selection. Lewis believed that evolutionism, like Fraudianism, contained a fatal self-contradiction regarding the human mind. According to the Darwinian view, reason was simply the unforeseen and unintended byproduct of a mindless process, based on survival of the fittest. Lewis pointed out the key difficulty with the Darwinian account of reason. If my own mind is a product of the irrational, he asked, how shall I trust my mind when it tells me about evolution? In his personal copy of Charles Darwin's autobiography, Lewis underlined passages where Darwin had asked himself the same question.
But then with me the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of a man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind?
What this means is that if natural selection and random genetic mutations gave rise to our intellectual capacities, we should assume that our intellectual capacities are consistent with survival-enhancing behavior, but we should have no especially good reason to believe that we actually know truth, or that our intellectual faculties even have that capacity of connecting with truth as one of its natural outcomes, because that's not what it was designed for. If anything, our reason is just sort of along for the ride with our survival-enhancing behaviors, which natural selection over millions of years has selected. So the implication of Lewis's argument here is that if naturalism is true and the Darwinian mechanism more or less accounts for our faculties, we probably shouldn't trust our reason.
The idea that a blind and purposeless process without a mind can produce things like human beings that have minds, and produce moral beliefs and things that sometimes go against our need for physical survival. The idea that a mindless process of survival in the fittest could create such things really was an outlandish one, according to Lewis. How could a mindless process produce minds? And to think that it could really just shows how gullible people can be in the name of science.
3, 2, 1, 0.
The third similarity between science and magic, according to Lewis, is the quest for power.
Magic was about the quest for power. Magicians wanted to have power over the world and over the universe. They wanted to harness the powers of nature and the deeper powers of nature in order to control it. And Lewis said that much of modern science, not all, but much of modern science was actually devoted towards power over the world.
For many people in the 20th century, the power of modern science was its greatest virtue. They hoped science would usher in a new age of peace and prosperity, a scientific utopia.
All curves and plastic. Monsanto's House of the Future is open to the public at Disneyland. The 4-wing plastic shell makes a snug and solid 5-room dwelling designed for a family of 4. And coincidentally, it's a fairly typical family of 4 that gets first look. A family food center to store atomically irradiated food. A work surface that includes a combination supersonic dishwasher and storage unit. A look at the future. Looks good, eh?
For the scientific utopians of Lewis's era, science was the savior that would allow us to remake our world.
What gets under your skin about research is the attitude of the men in the labs. They work on the principle that nothing is impossible.
You hear that, Bud?
Well, sure, but I don't believe it.
Open your eyes, Bud. The proof's all around you.
And of course that can be good. Modern science brings us good things. Many things from the microwave oven to the computers to life-saving treatments of modern medicine, which Lewis certainly appreciated. But on the other hand, that tendency to want to control things can bring us the Orwellian state of George Orwell's 1984. And so Lewis thought that modern science, in fact, was far more dangerous than magic, because magic failed. Magic doesn't work at the end of the day. And so it wasn't so dangerous because people actually couldn't use it to control the world. Modern science has the potential that you really can control people. If you find the right drugs or find the right treatments, you can manipulate them. And so if you don't have some other way of protecting and limiting what you do in the name of science, some ethical basis that isn't dictated by science itself that can control it, then you are facing a really bleak future.
Lewis's critique of scientific utopianism was at the heart of his novel That Hideous Strength, which tells the story of a conspiracy to transform England into a scientific dictatorship. The conspiracy is led by a government bureaucracy with the deceptively innocuous name of the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, or NICE.
I think that Hideous Strength and Huxley's Brave New World are the two greatest dystopias in our language in the 20th century.
The agenda of NICE in That Hideous Strength reads like a wish list drawn up by the era's leading scientific social reformers. It included sterilization of the unfit, selective breeding, biochemical conditioning, experimentation on both animals and criminals, and above all, truly scientific planning.
A scientific planning that is pretending to provide a new humanity that is doing away with traditional ethics, that is doing away with all traditional restraints.
Lewis depicts a world in That Hideous Strength in which nothing is sacred. Daniel Bell has told us that the essence of modernity is that nothing is sacred. In The Abolition of Man and also in That Hideous Strength, we see the consequences of a world in which nothing is sacred, which includes the human person. The human person is not sacred, and when that happens, there are no distinctions between individuals or humans and animals or humans and vegetables or humans and minerals, and we have the kind of thing we've had in the 20th century.
In the 2 decades before his death, Lewis became increasingly alarmed by the rise of scientific authoritarianism.
Lewis was very concerned by the dogmatic use of science, and that is why he wrote his novel That Hideous Strength. That is why he wrote his book The Abolition of Man, where he actually worries and somewhat sort of predicts the rise of a new class of people, of experts speaking in the name of science, who would dictate to everyone else. In fact, by the end of his life, Lewis was worrying about the rise of what he called scientocracy, government and society that claims to be based on the claims of modern science, but in reality really is based on a scientific clique of a few people who are speaking in the name of science. And maybe they are adopting the majority view of science, but they're claiming the right to rule based on their scientific knowledge and expertise.
Lewis's concern about authoritarian science seems eerily prophetic. In a world driven by science and technology, those who question the new order, like C.S. Lewis did, increasingly find themselves labelled anti-science. C.S. Lewis would have rejected the charge.
Lewis did not accept the idea that science was a special form of knowledge that was somehow immune to inspection, that was somehow cordoned off from the non-specialist assessing the deliverances of the sciences. Lewis was well aware that, first of all, that there's no such thing as science as such. There are sciences, and each science has its particular methods and its particular areas of study. And also that the sciences, to be good, need to interact with one another, but they do so by means of the larger tools of good, rational, critical thinking. And so that the things that the scientists say are subject to review by everyone who is able to think well, to think critically, to think rationally.
Lewis did not deny that scientific expertise might be necessary for good public policy in many areas, but he insisted that science alone was not sufficient.
Knowing, say, how things work, knowing how cells work, or knowing how ecosystems work, doesn't tell you what you ought to do for your society. Because public policy is not just about the technical expertise of how things work. It's about what good is worth having at what price. And as C.S. Lewis pointed out, on these questions, a scientific training gives you no added value. Scientists are not moral philosophers, yet political and social judgments involve not just how do things work and how can we make them work better, but how should we act, and what's worth spending money on, and what's worth doing, and what freedoms are worth giving up or not. And on these sorts of moral and ethical questions, someone's science training doesn't give them the right to dictate to the rest of society. C.S. Lewis thought that science was a good thing, but he also thought that it held some really strong dangers. The biggest danger really was the penchant to control. In a scientific view, if you think that is the only way that we have knowledge of the world, and so if you think that if I have the scientific truth about something, that's, end of story, I know everything, that really tends to feed a power trip. Whether you're a scientist or you're a politician who's trying to latch on to the prestige of science, you really have people who are going to abuse their power because they think, look, we're the only ones who know what should happen because we know how the universe really works. Therefore, we should be able to dictate what our cultural beliefs are. We should dictate what our government should do, how we should design governmental programs. We should dictate all manner of public policy, and that anyone who doesn't have a scientific training or isn't part of the consensus view of science is basically stupid or against progress or against science, and so should be really swept by the wayside and shouldn't be listened to. And I think Lewis thought that that almost totalitarian impulse was really a dangerous thing. Lewis, I think, was properly so frightened by that potential within science. And that's why he stressed why we really need a way to understand the limits of science, and that there is something behind science, a larger transcendent ethical sphere behind science, and that we aren't just blind matter in motion, that we're part of a designed universe that actually sets limits on what we should and shouldn't do.
It's an age-old problem. How do we prevent something good from being twisted for evil ends? C.S. Lewis hoped that scientists themselves would find a way to rescue science from scientism, creating a regenerate science that respected human rights and honored human dignity, a science that would no longer be the magician's twin.
I'm a scientist. I don't know any evidence against evolution.
In the sultry summer of 1925, a battle royale raged in Dayton, Tennessee, as political titans Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan clashed in the trial of high school teacher John Scopes, who was accused of teaching the evolution of humans from lower animals. The Scopes trial cast a long shadow. Even today, it continues to be used to dismiss anyone skeptical of evolution as unintelligent or unsophisticated. Few people would ever accuse famous Oxford scholar C.S. Lewis of being either. Yet during the summer of the Scopes trial in America, a 20-something C.S. Lewis in England was expressing his own doubts about Darwin. A veteran of the front lines of World War I, Lewis had just been elected a Fellow of Magdalen College at Oxford. Previously a tutor in philosophy, his new position was in English literature. A few weeks after the Scopes trial, C.S. Lewis wrote his father about his change in academic fields. He commented that although he was glad of the change, he was grateful for something he had learned from philosophy. "It will be a comfort to me all my life," he wrote, "to know that the scientist and the materialist have not the last word, that Darwin and Spencer, undermining ancestral beliefs, stand themselves on a foundation of sand, of gigantic assumptions and irreconcilable contradictions." Lewis was an atheist at this point in his life, but he already had gnawing doubts about Darwin's theory. Lewis retained a keen interest in evolution for the rest of his life. He discussed the topic repeatedly in his books and essays. He wrote about it in his private letters, and his personal library contained more than a dozen books and pamphlets focused on evolution, some of which were marked up with extensive underlining and annotations, including his personal copy of Charles Darwin's autobiography. Yet, for many people, Lewis's view of evolution remains a mystery. Some argue he ultimately embraced Darwinian evolution. Others claim he dismissed evolution as a myth. What were his real views, and are they relevant for us today?
To understand Lewis's view of evolution, I think we first need to ask, what is evolution? Really, there are two big claims of modern evolutionary theory as a scientific theory. The first is common ancestry. Everything goes back to one universal common ancestor. So human beings, we don't just share an ancestor, say, with chimps, we share an ancestor with fungi. Everything goes back to one common ancestor. The second claim is that the primary engine of how evolution took place was a blind, undirected process of natural selection acting on random variations in nature. So really it's an unguided, blind, purposeless process. And that really was Darwin's view. And that really is the modern view accepted by most biologists. So what was Lewis's view on this? Well, on common ancestry, Lewis had no objection in principle to common ancestry, although in practice he was somewhat skeptical, especially of some of the claims about human evolution. Again, he had no principled objection to it, he had no theological objection to it, but he did think some of the science might be overblown, and so he never really unreservedly embraced it. And near the end of his life, when there was the big scandal about the Piltdown Man, that was supposed to be one of the big missing links between humans and pre-human ancestors, that was exploded as really a hoax and a fake during Lewis's life. Lewis was rather amused and bemused by that. And it's interesting that a couple of years before the Piltdown hoax was actually formally exposed, but there had already been some questions raising about it, Lewis already wrote a poem poking fun at the fake from Piltdown, even before the hoax had been generally exposed, just when people were raising some critical questions about it.
Apart from common ancestry, Lewis knew that the truly momentous claim of modern evolutionary theory is its insistence that life is the product of a blind and unguided process. Darwin himself repeatedly made clear that evolution by natural selection acted without the benefit of design or foresight. In his words, the old argument of design in nature, which formerly seemed to me so conclusive, fails now that the law of natural selection has been discovered. This remains the dominant view of evolution in the scientific community today. In the words of 38 Nobel laureates, evolution is the result of an unguided, unplanned process of random variation and natural selection. C.S. Lewis was deeply skeptical that unguided natural selection could create fundamentally new things.
He did think natural selection was a real process, but when he wrote about it, he said, well, it can do things like, you can have a wing and it can knock out something. It can basically make you less complicated. It can knock out an existing function. So really what he was talking about there, what today would be called microevolutionary processes. Lewis doesn't talk a lot about natural selection being able to create, much more complicated and intricate things or higher level organisms.
Lewis's view of the limits of natural selection was shaped by the work of Henri Bergson, a French natural philosopher and Nobel laureate who was sharply critical of natural selection in his book Creative Evolution. Lewis first read Bergson during World War I while recovering from shrapnel wounds. Bergson believed in evolution, but he didn't think that Darwin's mechanism of natural selection was sufficient to account for it.
The Darwinian idea of adaptation by automatic elimination of the unadapted is a simple and clear idea. But because it attributes to the cause which controls evolution a merely negative influence, it has great difficulty in accounting for the progressive development of complex apparatus such as we are about to examine. How can accidental causes, occurring in an accidental order, be supposed to have repeatedly come to the same result, the causes being infinitely numerous and the effect infinitely complicated?
The impact of Bergson on C.S. Lewis was profound. Lewis filled his copy of Bergson's book with annotations and underlining on most of its nearly 400 pages, including passages where Bergson critiqued natural selection. Years later, during a lecture in the 1940s, Lewis reaffirmed the view that Bergson's critique of orthodox Darwinism is not easy to answer. But Lewis's doubts about Darwin's mechanism went beyond those raised by Bergson. According to Lewis, the ultimate challenge to unguided natural selection was man himself. How could such a blind material process produce humanity's unique capabilities of reason and conscience? Darwin wrote an entire book, The Descent of Man, to show how his theory of evolution could account for man's mind and morals. Lewis was not persuaded, and his doubts were reinforced by a book from one of his favorite authors, G.K. Chesterton. The book was Chesterton's The Everlasting Man, which Lewis read for the first time in the 1920s. Chesterton argued that man is not merely an evolution, but rather a revolution, one that was beyond the power of a strictly Darwinian process. Another book that influences Lewis's doubts about Darwin was Theism and Humanism by former British Prime Minister Sir Arthur Balfour. Best remembered as the author of the Balfour Declaration that favored a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine, Balfour was also an articulate critic of scientific materialism. Balfour's book argued that if we would maintain the value of our highest beliefs and emotions, beauty must be more than accident. The source of morality must be moral. The source of knowledge must be rational. Lewis drew heavily from Balfour's argument in his own book, Miracles. Like Balfour, Lewis claimed that assigning the development of human reason to a non-rational process, like natural selection, ends up undermining our confidence in reason itself. After all, if reason is merely an unintended byproduct of a fundamentally non-rational process, what grounds do we have for regarding its conclusions as objectively true? Lewis knew that the corrosive impact of a Darwinian account of the mind was not merely theoretical. In his personal copy of Darwin's autobiography, he highlighted passages where Darwin himself questioned whether the conclusions of a mind produced by a Darwinian process could in fact be trusted.
But then with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of a man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind?
Just as Lewis rejected a Darwinian explanation for the human mind because it undermined the validity of reason, he rejected a Darwinian account of morality because it undercut the authority of morality by attributing it to an amoral process of survival of the fittest. As Lewis pointed out, the same Darwinian process that produces morality also produces immorality. Because all beliefs and behaviors arise in the same way, there is no objective reason to prefer one over the other. According to Lewis, the person who offers such an account of morality should honestly admit that there is no such thing as right or wrong. Despite his skepticism of key parts of Darwinian theory, Lewis disagreed with fellow Christians, who seemed ready to dismiss all of evolution as necessarily atheistic. At the same time, he also was skeptical of some Christians who thought there were no tensions between orthodox Darwinian theory and belief in God.
In fact, Lewis was highly critical of theists and others who tried to find a halfway house between blind Darwinian evolution and theism or something else. And this was where he actually was critical of Henri Bergson. Henri Bergson, he accepted Bergson's critique of natural selection. But Bergson then said, well, Darwinian evolution won't work as this blind, unguided process. But Bergson didn't want to embrace a guided process by an intelligence. And so he ended up saying, well, there's an emergent form of evolution that sort of does grope towards complexity, and it is sort of purposeful, but there really is no purposeful agent. And Lewis thought this was nonsense. You really don't have much of a choice. Either evolution, if it happened, was a mindless process, or it was directed by a mind. If it was directed by a mind, then basically it was directed by intelligent design. And as long as you thought that evolution was driven by a mind, then Lewis would be fine with that. He wasn't fine with people who tried to split the difference. And today, a lot of people who call themselves theistic evolutionists really want to split the difference. They claim that they don't want to believe that it was just chance and necessity, but they actually talk about evolution having these natural capacities that somehow acts purposefully even though it's not being directed. And this is a point that Lewis made in his book Mere Christianity, where he had a little addendum to one of the chapters where he attacks Bergson and others who promote this idea of emergent evolution, that somehow, even without a mind, it's not blind like Darwin thought it was, so it's somewhat purposeful without someone who has a purpose. And Lewis said, again, this just logically doesn't make sense. Lewis, near the end of his life, read a book by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, The Phenomenon of Man, one of the leading theistic evolutionists of Lewis's day. This was actually a book published after Desjardins' death. It's somewhat humorous to read Lewis's annotations of his own copy of Desjardins' book because it has all these snarky comments raising questions for Desjardins. And in fact, we know from Lewis's letters to people that Lewis really was not persuaded at all by Desjardins. And again, in Lewis's lifetime, this was one of the preeminent spokespeople for this sort of emergent type of theistic, non-theistic evolution that tries to square the difference and say that you can have evolution that isn't just quite blind in a Darwinian sense, but also isn't directed by design.
As he grew older, Lewis became even more critical of evolutionary theory. Some of Lewis's mounting skepticism was likely due to his correspondence with Captain Bernard Ackworth, a leader in Britain's evolution protest movement. Starting in the mid-1940s, Ackworth began sending Lewis books and essays critical of Darwin's theory, materials which Lewis read and retained for his private library. In 1951, Ackworth sent Lewis a lengthy manuscript critical of evolution. Lewis wrote back that he had read nearly all of Ackworth's manuscript and it had shaken him. The most telling point for Lewis was the dogmatism of the evolutionary scientists cited by Ackworth. Lewis told Ackworth that it was the fanatical and twisted attitudes of evolution's defenders that now inclined him to agree that evolution was the central and radical lie in the whole web of falsehood that now governs our lives. Lewis was troubled by the growing intolerance he saw among evolutionists, who seemed to treat any criticism of their views as an attack upon science itself. Lewis had a sharply different vision of what science should be like. In his view, there was nothing anti-science about questioning dogmatic claims made in the name of science. Indeed, he thought good science recognized the benefits of questions and criticisms in helping science correct its own errors. Lewis's growing awareness of the fallibility of science was expressed powerfully in his final book, The Discarded Image. Published after his death, the book on its surface is an exploration of the medieval worldview, but one of its underlying themes is the nature of modern science. Lewis argues in the book that scientific theories are supposals rather than facts. These supposals try to account for as many facts as possible, with as few assumptions as possible. But according to Lewis, we must always recognize that such supposals by scientists are provisional. They can be wrong. Lewis further argued that scientific revolutions often are not the result simply of discovering new facts.
Lewis was very perceptive when it came to scientific revolutions. He pointed out that science often changes not just because of the evidence, but because people see what they want to see. One of the scientific revolutions he pointed out was this way, was actually the Darwinian revolution in biology. He said, you can look for the decades and centuries before Darwin proclaimed his theory for people really yearning for a developing universe with progress, with inevitable progress, going from ruder and cruder things to more developed things. And he said that idea predated Darwin. And then when Darwin came up with his ideas were accepted largely, in Lewis's view, because this earlier presupposition, this earlier idea that we wanted to see progress in nature was there to begin with. And so we saw what we wanted to see. This was a pretty radical view of science. It really countered the view that I think we all get in school, which is science, at least modern science, goes from triumph to triumph. It's from the age of superstition back in the Middle Ages to now, science is just the focus on the facts, look at the evidence, that's all there is, and stuff that has enough evidence, that's what changes in science. And one of the dangers of being in an existing scientific paradigm, or what Lewis would call a scientific model of an era, is that it limits you to asking only certain questions and blinds you to asking other questions. And he was concerned about that and thought that people should be concerned about what questions weren't being asked. And I think that's very relevant to us today. For example, with Darwinian theory, you can think of all sorts of things that we've been blinded to asking because we're enmeshed in sort of that paradigm. For example, for many years, scientists thought that the vast majority of our DNA was junk. They thought this because they thought we were the product of a blind Darwinian process, and so it would be rational to expect that much of our DNA is just junk. On the other hand, if you actually believe that things were developed through intelligent design, you might not rush to that conclusion. You might actually think that, well, if you have lots of DNA that doesn't seem to have a purpose, because it doesn't code for proteins, that there may yet be a purpose there if things were intelligently designed. And in fact, what we've seen in the past just 3 to 5 years is an avalanche of evidence, basically, that the so-called junk DNA, the non-protein coding DNA, is fulfilling very useful functions. In fact, sometimes critical functions that we couldn't even exist if it wasn't happening. And so far from being useless or junk DNA, it's really critical. Well, this was really a great example of what Lewis was talking about, in that your current paradigm limits the sort of questions you're asking. Now that we've actually found out this evidence, scientists are having to own up to it, but Darwinism really did help limit or help restrict people even from asking that question to begin with. Another thing is the Darwinian obsession over the past century for vestigial organs. Whether it be the appendix or tonsils, if you doesn't seem to work in a certain way, the Darwinian explanation is write it off. That's something, a leftover product from the evolutionary process. Yet in many of these things, including the tonsils and the appendix, we now know have vital biological functions. So again, Darwinism actually as a paradigm helps restrict what questions you even ask of nature. And so I think one of the things that we can learn from Lewis is the importance of asking questions outside the box in science.
A few months after being discharged from the army at the end of World War I, a 20-year-old C.S. Lewis published his first book, a cycle of poems titled Spirits in Bondage. The opening poem, Satan Speaks, provided a grim portrait of nature that might startle many of Lewis's later readers. I am nature, the mighty mother. I am the law, ye have none other. I am the flower and the dewdrop fresh. I am the lust in your itching flesh. I am the battle's filth and strain. I am the widow's empty pain. I am the sea to smother your breath. I am the bomb, the falling death. I am the spider making her net. I am the beast with jaws blood wet. Lewis's passionate, even angry atheism during his early years was inspired by what he referred to as the argument from undesign. The idea that nature's cruelty and waste supplies the best evidence against a belief in a benevolent creator. Lewis's attraction to the argument from undesign reflected personal tragedies such as his mother's death during his childhood. But it also showed the impact of writers like H.G. Wells, who nourished the young Lewis's imagination with depictions of a universe that was vast, cold, and impersonal. Even after Lewis accepted Christianity, the argument from undesign made him skeptical of some traditional arguments for the Christian God based on the intelligent design of nature.
Lewis never thought that the evidence for intelligent design alone could get you to belief in a Christian God. And in that way, he was similar to many modern intelligent design theorists who think that the evidence for intelligent design is important in defeating materialism and can actually help you understand that there is a need for a transcendent intelligent cause. But determining whether that cause is God or what other attributes he may have goes beyond just the scientific evidence and requires evidence from philosophy and history and other forms of argument. And so Lewis, although he appreciated intelligent design, always thought that it was a more limited argument, and in that way he anticipated many of the arguments of current intelligent design theorists.
Despite Lewis's skepticism of some arguments for God's existence based on intelligent design, he ended up offering several positive arguments supportive of intelligent design in nature.
The story of how Lewis went from believing and being convinced by the argument from undesign to understanding that the universe displayed evidence of intelligent design is really intriguing. It basically is the story of how Lewis had to confront evidence throughout nature and the human world that really didn't fit with the materialist worldview. And that evidence ultimately persuaded him that there needed to be something more than materialism, and really brought him to the belief that there really was design in the universe.
Lewis's first argument supportive of intelligent design was the argument from natural beauty. From early on, Lewis's pessimistic view of nature as cruel and wasteful was balanced by the longings nature stirred within him. For Lewis, our experience of beauty in nature pointed to the reality of something beyond nature. Atoms dead could never thus stir the human heart of us, unless the beauty that we see, the veil of endless beauty be. In Lewis's view, the longings provoked by earthly beauty could not be accounted for by a blind and mechanical universe. They required a transcendent cause outside of nature. This cause was not necessarily personal, but it did go beyond undirected matter and energy. As a consequence, it put intelligent design back on the table as one of the options for discussion. Lewis's second argument supportive of intelligent design was the argument from morality.
It was really the moral law that got Lewis thinking about how the argument from undesign ultimately was unsatisfactory. Because if we really think that the universe is evil or that it's cruel, where do we get that standard from? If the universe is just what it is, and it just is put together because of blind matter and motion, and it couldn't be anything else, then where do we get off expressing outrage at it? It's just the way it is. So if we really think that there is a moral right and wrong, as most people do, and we want to hold to that belief, we really have to come up with some explanation other than blind matter and motion. In fact, The moral law, Lewis thought, pointed towards the need for a transcendent cause for morality. And that transcendent cause for morality opens the door to considering intelligent design as the explanation for morality.
Lewis's third argument, supportive of intelligent design, was the argument from reason.
The argument from reason is just the argument that in a naturalistic worldview, reason isn't going to fit. Because in the last analysis, everybody's thoughts are going to be the result of non-rational causes. You're basically trying to say that human reasoning, the very kind of reasoning that produced the origin of species, that produced Einstein's theory of relativity, that adds, subtracts, divides numbers, and so forth. What you're saying is all of that is ultimately the product of irrational causes, non-rational causes. That is an incoherent position, okay? Because it says that somehow you can derive intelligence from that which is not intelligent.
Lewis's fourth argument, supportive of intelligent design, was the argument from functional complexity.
According to Lewis, modern science, especially Darwinian biology, has schooled us to think that crude and simple things in nature naturally develop into more complex and sophisticated things. The acorn turns into the oak tree. The egg turns into the owl. The human embryo turns into a full-fledged human being. Sometimes evolutionists even point to technological development as an example of this same process. The early locomotive engine supposedly evolved into the much more complicated modern train engine, or the simple boat evolved into the steamship or passenger ship. Lewis called this evolutionary view an optical illusion. What we really see in nature, according to Lewis, is simpler and less functional things habitually springing from things that are more complex and functional. If anything, it's a process of devolution, not evolution. Every acorn originally drops from a fully developed oak tree. Every owl's egg comes from a fully developed owl. Every human embryo requires two fully developed human parents. The same is true with technological evolution. The modern train engine didn't simply magically evolve from a simpler train engine, according to Lewis. It sprang from something far greater, the mind of man. And Lewis thought that just like we have to go outside the physical sequence of train engines to find the originator of the engines, we need to go outside the ordinary course of nature to find the originator of nature, the intelligent designer. Lewis's argument from functional complexity is an explicit argument for intelligent design.
Lewis's argument from functional complexity was based on his belief that an effect could not be greater than its original cause. Put another way, a copy could not be better than the original. This was a Platonic idea that Lewis found in medieval writers, such as Boethius.
I think his most consistent argument was the argument from the copy and the original. You see it in fiction, non-fiction, all over the place. And he argues there that if we consider the source of an idea, it's not possible for the idea to contain more information than could be found in the sum of its causes. Lewis, in an informal way, seems to have anticipated some of the ideas of Bill Dembski here, because Bill Dembski has published many works that support the idea that you really can't get new information out of undirected causes. You have to go to some intelligent source. And Lewis's various versions of this argument from the copy and the original always take you back to some source that already contained information.
In addition to making his own positive arguments for intelligent design, Lewis answered some common objections to intelligent design, such as the idea that it's an obstacle to scientific progress.
It's commonly argued that intelligent design is a science stopper, but C.S. Lewis pointed out that he thought it was a science starter. According to Lewis, early scientists looked for regularities and laws in nature because they thought there was a legislator behind nature. Far from frustrating the progress of science, the belief in design helped inspire it. According to Lewis, the fact that many modern scientists reject intelligent design is what should concern us. If they no longer believe in the lawgiver behind nature, why should they continue to expect nature to act reasonably or to be able to find regularities in nature?
Another objection to intelligent design answered by Lewis was the idea that the laws of nature make design unnecessary.
Sometimes people argue that the laws of nature can create highly complex biological features without the need for intelligent design. But Lewis pointed out that the laws of nature can't do anything themselves. They require input from outside. The laws of motion don't make the billiard balls move. It's the player with the cue who hits the ball that makes the balls move. The laws of nature describe what will happen given certain inputs, but they don't explain away the need for the inputs in the first place.
Perhaps C.S. Lewis's greatest contribution to the debate over intelligent design was his support for open discussion and debate.
I don't think most people really realize how dedicated Lewis was to the idea of open inquiry and free debate in his own life. In fact, while he was at Oxford University, he helped found a group called the Oxford Socratic Club, whose reason for existence was to debate the merits and the evidence for Christianity. They met every week, and lots of students went to it, and faculty, and they hashed out the arguments pro and con, and they adopted as their motto an injunction from Socrates that we should follow the argument wherever it leads.
And it was before this group that a young graduate student presented a paper eloquently arguing for atheism. That student went on to become one of the world's leading academic atheists. His name was Antony Flew.
Flew was never convinced by Lewis's arguments for theism, but he admired C.S. Lewis, and especially Lewis's dedication to following the argument where it leads. And he adopted that motto as his own motto. So much so that near the end of his life, Antony Flew shocked many of his colleagues and people around the world by declaring that he thought the evidence now showed that there was a God. He had followed the argument where it led, and it led him to belief in God. And what was really determinative of that was some of the arguments for intelligent design.
The integrated complexity of the organic world is just inordinately greater. You know, all the creatures are complicated pieces of design.
Just like Lewis, Flew had followed the argument where it led, and it led him to intelligent design.
In an age of increasing dogmatism in the name of science, C.S. Lewis's defense of the unhindered search for truth is just as relevant for us today as it was during his own lifetime, maybe even more so. As Lewis knew, it's by continuing to pursue the argument that we can discover new worlds, explore new wonders, and grasp new truths.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal,